Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And it's the weekend, so that means it's time for another stream. Feel free to share yesterday's stream for those who want to read Alex Van Halen's new book, which I loved. I did a full review on that on the Saturday stream. But after Saturday comes Sunday, and that's where we are now. And we're taking another trip around the world. Yesterday's stream began in Holland, in Amsterdam, to be specific. And today we're talking all about Spain. Now, Spanish music is among the most popular and influential in the world, so much so that we almost don't think about just how pervasive it is. But even a sort of skin deep look at the wider musical world of the last 200 years up to the present day, and we will start to speak Spanish. And let's try to think of why, because there's never one reason alone for these sorts of things. There's always more than one. I think one of the reasons is that Spanish classical music developed rather independently of the other great classical traditions in Europe. When we think of the great classical traditions in Europe, we tend to think, if we're talking about sort of Baroque or Renaissance, we tend to think about Italy, and then we transition to thinking about Germany when we get deeper into the high classical period and the Romantic era. There was a parallel tradition in Russia that began in the 19th century and became globally popular. And of course, there were traditions that are tangentially related to the German school, such as the Scandinavian school. You could argue that Dutch classical music is very much part of the Germano-Austrian type of feel. And then you have parts of the Austrian Empire that had a unique school of music of their own. Places like Hungary, places like Bohemia, what became Czechoslovakia and later the Czech Republic, or Czechia as they call it now. But Spain was somewhat isolated from this geographically, which allowed its classical music to develop in a very folkish manner, much like Russia's did. But unlike Russia's, but classical music, which specifically did not have a religious influence because the Russian Orthodox Church prohibits instrumental music. Chanting is the liturgical form of musical worship, we could say there. In Spain, that wasn't the issue. There were other interesting things going on. You had a lot of influence from the Roman Catholic Church, as you did in much of the rest of Europe, apart from the Orthodox areas, but more interestingly, in terms of what made Spain different, you also had the profound influence of Arabic music, because until the very end of the 15th century, either all or much of the Iberian Peninsula was ruled by Arab Muslim caliphs, who brought with them from what we now call the Middle East a very distinctive style of highly chromatic music. And when you combine that with the pre-Arabic conquest folkish music and the music of the Roman Catholic Church in Southern Europe, you get some really interesting things that don't really map on easily to the other traditions, whether it be those of northern Italy, those of Austria and Germany, or those of neighboring France to the north. And this continued over the years. And the other thing that really made Spanish music so not only identifiable, but so ubiquitous is the fact that for Spain invented the instrument that is today the most commonly owned instrument in the world. And this is the guitar. And there's a lot of reasons for it. One, unlike the piano, which is an incredibly popular instrument, it's portable, which is a big plus. And unlike wind instruments that are portable, the guitar can play chords. And an instrument that plays chords is great as either a solo instrument or as an accompanying instrument. So, for instance, you can play the guitar and sing, you can play the guitar while someone else sings, or you can play the guitar while other people play an instrument that can really, that cannot play chords, your trumpets, your saxophones, etc. And the Spanish guitar is really implicitly linked to the great renaissance of Spanish music that took place towards the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, just really before and frankly during the Spanish Spanish Civil War and the Francoist government that came after that. So it's a very interesting time in Spanish history. This was a time when the Spanish Empire was contracting, and yet creativity was growing. Very interesting as well. We'll get back to the importance of the Spanish Empire and all of this as well. But I just want to tell you about some of the really good composers in this sort of late 19th up to the 20th century era. And one of my very favorites was Isaac Albinez. Absolutely a wonderful, wonderful composer who, in some ways, better or at least as good as any of his contemporaries, encapsulate that Spanish folkish, somewhat spiritual tradition in the context of modern European music, art music, or classical music, even though, of course, we're heavily into the Romantic era by Albinez's time. And his most well known piece is Iberia, named for the peninsula of which Spain is the main geographical area of. And the piece was written for piano, and there's some wonderful piano performances you can find. It's also been orchestrated for a full modern romantic symphony orchestra. And of course, many people play it on guitar. It's been arranged for guitar by many composers and guitarists because anything with Spanish themes, whether it's composed for the piano or for an orchestra or for the violin, it begs for guitar. All Spanish music sort of does. And again, this is very unique because while the guitar is the most ubiquitous instrument in the world, it's really only in Spain that we find this essence of let's compose truly art, classical music for the guitar. And since then, others have done the same in other parts of the world. John McLaughlin has written a concerto for guitar, but it's really, stop one on the guitar train is Spain, and for very good reason. So Albinez, wonderful, wonderful composer. Another great composer who wrote one of the most important pieces in the history of the guitar was Joaquin Rodrigo, and his Concerto de Oranjou is one of the absolute pinnacle pieces of the guitar. And all of his works are, again, quintessentially Spanish. You hear them and you think of Spain. And this is another reason that I think Spanish music is so popular. It's a type of music that allows for accessibility because the tonality of it, the kinds of harmonies, the rhythms, it's a highly rhythmic music while also being harmonically rich. It's something that's accessible. And what makes it accessible is that it delights. It's very joyful music on the whole, but at the same time, it allows for virtuosity, mainly on the guitar, but orchestrally and other instruments, because there's so much you can do in terms of soloing around these rhythms, these unique Spanish rhythms. And that's really made Spanish music a real favorite of many. For instance, in the late 50s, when we had what we would now call audiophile labels releasing a lot of classical music, Spanish music became really popular as showpieces for audio fidelity. So if you wanted to test out a new stereo system in the late 50s, early 60s, the lovely gentleman at the shop would maybe put on a Spanish flavored record. And the most well known of which, and it's one of my favorite records of all time, it was released on Decca in 1958, and it's called España, appropriately enough. And it's conducted by the foremost Spanish composer of the 20th century, Ataulfo Argenta. And he was incredibly talented. Now, the music on this album, half of it is by Spanish composers, and the other is by composers who aren't Spanish, but composing in a Spanish style, in an overt tribute to Spain. It's a wonderful album. You should definitely try to listen to it. A lot of other of these proto-audiophile labels came out with their own Spanish-themed classical records. Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony did one called Spain, appropriately enough, on RCA Living Stereo. Mercury Living Presence had a Spanish-themed album conducted by Frederick Finel, and another one conducted by Antal Dorati. Westminster Records did the same. If you were one of these labels that had audiophile quality classical music, chances are you were going to put out a showpiece record with Spanish music because it delights. And when you're trying to sell a stereo system, you want to delight. And when a guitar is recorded well, you can really almost feel it near you. And I think that's another reason that either guitar or guitar derived music is very popular in that genre. España itself is all orchestral, not guitar, but some of the other things that came out around that time very much were. So we'll come back to Rodrigo in a moment because his story doesn't end there. Another one of the grand orchestral and piano composers of Spain in the late 19th and early 20th century was Manuel de Falla. And his most famous piece is the Three Cornered Hat, suites of which became very well known. So many people recorded it. It's on that Fritz Reiner Spain album. And one of the most beloved versions is by the Swiss conductor Ernest Ansermet, who did a wonderful audiophile version for Decca. Decca, of course, the SXL series in Europe and the London Bluebacks in North America. They're the same thing, different names, but again, one of these proto audiophile labels, and they couldn't get enough of this wonderful Spanish music. Another one of the great composers who really specialized in guitar, he was really a guitar virtuoso. This was Francesco Tarreja, and he was just a virtuoso of his era and someone who continues to be beloved by guitarists everywhere. Now, of course, let's get to the performers as well as the composers. And someone who did both, but is probably most well known as a composer, pardon me, as a performer, was Segovia. Segovia was one of the absolute finest guitarists, Andres Segovia. And he recorded lots of music. Some of his most famous works, in addition to the Spanish composers of his home and his original music, are his Bach arrangements for guitar. And because Bach did such interesting things with harmony, and because the guitar is such a beautiful chordal instrument, Segovia did absolutely wonderful things on guitar. So if you're looking for a performer who really represents the essence of this Spanish style, whether in Spanish music or in guitar itself, I would absolutely check him out. A group of Spanish guitarists who recorded a lot for the audiophile label Mercury Living Presence in the 50s and 60s were Los Romanos. Very, very good stuff. So you'll definitely want to check them out. All of their stuff is luckily on Spotify. And of course, you can find lots and lots of their stuff on all the other streaming services. The same, of course, goes for Segovia. Now, what about the music that was influenced by Spanish music? Because a lot of composers at this time were highly, highly influenced by Spanish music. Rimsky-Korsakov was one, and Russia, obviously not near to Spain, doesn't really have too many cultural similarities, except for the fact that just as sure as Russian classical music was a product of the 20th century, pardon me, of the 19th century, that is, and into the 20th century, so too was this kind of renaissance of Spanish music in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. And so definitely check out Rimsky-Korsakov's Capriccio Español. It's on that wonderful, hold on, I just need to shut this thing off so it stops ringing in my ear. Not a guitar, but an annoying internet sound. How do others do it? I don't know. So it's on that España album conducted by Argenta. So you'll definitely want to check that out. And Sviatlanov, also the great Russian conductor, did a wonderful version of that, and so many others. There's the French composer Emmanuel Chabrier, wonderful stuff that he composed in the Spanish style. The French composer Bizet introduced the world to so many Spanish themes with Carmen, possibly the most accessible opera of all time. Debussy did Iberia, Ravel's Bolero, a famous Spanish rhythm pattern. The Germano-Polish composer Morris Moscowitzki. Polish names aren't the easiest to pronounce. There's the old joke: what does a girl get when she marries a Polish man that's long and hard to handle? A new last name. Tchaikovsky incorporated Spanish music, and so many others. But it wasn't just in the field of classical music. The Spanish influence is so pervasive in popular music and in jazz and in so many other styles that don't derive from Spain, but that borrowed Spanish themes and put them into their own compositions. So one of the most well-known of all was Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain. Now, this was one of Miles's top-selling albums, and along with Kind of Blue, I think it very well may be. It features his own take on the Concerto de Aranjuez by Rodrigo. Will o' the Wisp is based on a composition by Manuel de Falla. There are traditional Spanish folk songs, and there's even a Gil Evans composition, Solea, which is based on Spanish themes. Now, this album was really unique because it sort of turned the jazz world on its head. Miles was someone who at this time was still much very into his either bebop or modal style of playing. And Sketches of Spain was cultural fusion. This was before the term jazz fusion was even invented. Miles would have to wait another 8 or so years before he decided to do that. But you could say that Sketches of Spain was a fusion album because it took Spanish classical music, much of which, including Rodrigo's masterpiece, Concerto de Orange, was designed for guitar, composed for guitar, and Miles played it on the trumpet, complete with very modern, interesting modal arrangements by the inimitable, the wonderful Gil Evans. So absolutely be sure and check that out. Chick Corea, or Correa, to give it the Spanish pronunciation, is of course someone who has ethnic heritage of Spain. He was born in the US, but his parents were Spanish, and Spanish music was always something that he would incorporate into both his compositions and his solos. His composition Spain, one of his most well-known compositions, La Fiesta, what could that be a reference to? Also very well known, My Spanish Heart. You don't have to dig too deep into Chick Corea's music to find his profound Spanish influence, and you could make the argument that whether he's playing jazz fusion with Return to Forever or the Chick Corea Electric Band, whether he's doing neoclassical music, improvisational stuff, avant-garde jazz, traditional jazz standards, he's always interpolating and incorporating Spanish style themes into the music. I mentioned Los Romanos, but getting back to the guitar, one of the most beloved guitarists of all time, Paco de Lucia. He was a real celebrity in Spain and around the world, beloved by rock musicians, by jazz musicians, by his fellow Spanish musicians. Truly a superstar who died a bit too young. At least it was a bit shocking when he died. He was 66, but it felt like the world deserved his art a bit more. Now, he was a star in Spain for a long time. And he ended up becoming huge in the U.S. when he did a trio. For the original trio was himself, John McLaughlin, and the great Larry Coryell. And eventually, Coryell was replaced by Al De Meola, another Chick Corea connection because they played together a lot. And the seminal album that I think was from 80 or 81, I want to say 81, Friday Night in San Francisco, that featured the three of them, was absolutely amazing. And that introduced a lot of non-Spanish audiences who would be familiar with Mahavishnu Orchestra and Return to Forever to the wonderful guitar playing of Paco de Lucia. So definitely check that out. The influence is so big that it even went into the pop charts. Now, Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass were obviously an American band, Herb Alpert from LA. Well, that's where he made his name. But he was influenced by the music of Mexico. And this is where we get to the importance artistically of the Spanish Empire. For a while, the Spanish Empire was one of the largest in all of history. Think of it, virtually all of what we now call Latin America, and I wonder why we call it that, apart from Brazil, was the Spanish Empire. And this not only meant the spread of the Spanish language and of Catholicism, but it also meant the spread of Spanish folk music and the spread of Spanish instruments. And so you see the ubiquity of guitars in the Latin parts of the New World, as some still call it. because of that Spanish influence. And so, while Herb Alpert was influenced primarily by the very Mexican style of mariachi, he took the leap back to Iberia. Things like Madrid, he wrote songs about Spanish City, Spanish Flea, which is kind of in a pseudo Spanish style, but enough to, whet the palate and get people interested. So I definitely think that while Mexico was the specific influence, there were definitely some nods to Spain. Granada was a song that Frank Sinatra did early in the days of his Reprise label, complete with a lush Spanish style arrangement for a bit, but then it goes into your classic swing, baby, because you can't stop Sinatra from swinging for too long. But that's actually one of my favorite Sinatra songs. Um, Really, really good stuff. Enrique Granados, another great composer, just to jump back to that I want everyone to be familiar with. Really wonderful stuff. And look at the influence of Spanish music just when it's staring you right in the face, but you wouldn't necessarily expect to find it. There's the great Three Dog Night song, Never Been to Spain. And the lyric is, I've never been to Spain, but I kind of like the music. And then, I've never been to heaven, but I've been to Oklahoma. It's a great geography lesson in itself. But hey, the idea of Spanish music is everywhere. The Doors, Spanish Caravan. You just can't escape it. Procol Harum, Conquistador, a song about the soldiers, if you will, the explorers and the conquerors of the Spanish Empire, done in a Spanish style. And when they did it with the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra on their live album from the early 70s, you even have some very Spanish style brass arrangements for you there. Eddie Van Halen, one of the great electric players of all time, he too influenced by Spain, because on the Van Halen 2 album, you have his acoustic solo, Spanish Fly. And so, you just cannot get away from Spain. Little guitars from Diver Down. There's a bit of Spanish influence there too, in a way. I'm sure that there's lots that I'm forgetting, but just the flamenco style of guitar, which is very much related to sort of the formal classical style of guitar. So many of the great prog rockers, look at Steve Howe and his Mood for a Day guitar solo from the Fragile album by Yes. Steve Hackett constantly talking about how he's influenced by Segovia. And you can really hear that not only in the acoustic guitar playing that he did with Genesis, but you can hear it on a lot of his classical guitar albums, because he's done a lot of them. And one of my favorites is one called Metamorpheus. It's complete with a small orchestra and a nylon string classical Spanish guitar. Spanish guitar gets a shout out in Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. We all know the song Spanish Eyes. Well, there you go. It really is everywhere. And the reasons for it, that was by Al Martino, who made that song quite famous. And so we see the ubiquity of of a Spanish instrument, the guitar. It's everywhere. We see Spanish rhythms being incorporated into pop music, jazz music, show tunes, rock music, all sorts of music from Latin America. Because a lot of Latin American music, like look at Cuban music, for instance, it's a combination of African music, indigenous music, and Spanish music. You look at Mexican music, you can feel the indigenous influences, you can feel the Spanish influences. It's really everywhere. Portuguese music is kind of its own thing in Brazil, but the fact that the guitar has become so prominent in bossa nova, it kind of explains it. Just as sure as Portugal, pardon me, is very near to Spain, so too with the Spanish guitars of the Spanish Empire, not very far from the import man standing at the border of the Portuguese Empire that later became Brazil in South America. And so when we think about which countries have influenced music, a lot, again, we think of Germany with things like Beethoven, Wagner, Brahms, Bach. We think of a lot of rock music. We think of America or the UK, basically the English speaking world. We think of bands, like the Beatles. We think of Chuck Berry. We think of, just everything, because it is kind of an English speaking dominated pop music world, especially if you're in Europe, North America, or other places that are kind of similar to that. But when you really think about it, I would venture to say that maybe outside of places like India and China, which are huge countries with their own classical traditions, or in Africa, where, of course, West African classical music, which is based around percussive classicism, is very unique. But when you exclude those huge areas, albeit so much Spanish influence everywhere, and you still feel it to this day. And so, Viva España, you've given us our favorite instrument globally, technically, and you've given us compositions and performance styles that are much beloved around the world. So, let me know what you think about your favorite Spanish composers or your favorite Spanish performers, your favorite artists who reference Spain. I mean, Bing Crosby did albums with Spanish themes. Just everyone. When you really look at both the great pop singers, when you look at the record labels putting out orchestral music, when you look at all of these things, you will find that everyone sooner or later does a Spanish album. It's just one of those things that is de rigueur. That's a French phrase. I think shouldn't use that. But it is just something that you kind of have to do, and audiences love it. I think maybe they always will because, well, I've never been to Spain. I kind of like the music. It's a good note to end on there. Remember to like and subscribe to this channel and share it around. I do things my way. I don't pander to any algorithms. So your love and support is very appreciated. You can now buy memberships, and I'm going to do some very special things. We can interact privately. We can share playlists. We can argue about music. We can go for a virtual drink. We can do all these sorts of things, but you got to join up or send super chats because that's always helpful too. Time marches on and this channel rolls on. Keep playing your Spanish guitars. We'll see you next time. Take care.